I will try to also keep an eye on the Q&A and the chats, just to see if we can work them in as we go along. So feel free to have comments, have questions. We'll have a good time. My name is Kendra Little, and I am an advocate, or I guess an advocate at Redgate Software. And what that means is these days I spend a lot of time thinking about database DevOps. So this topic, index tuning across dev and DBA silos, I'm kind of cheating here, and I don't think it's really cheating. I'm combining two of my very favorite things in this talk, which is performance tuning. Specifically, I really am interested often, I love index tuning, just how can I speed up my queries and my workload the best by tuning indexes, without having to change the code. But then also, how do I do this across these team silos? So how do I create kind of processes and ways of working together that are effective? And one way of talking about that is DevOps. Now, if you're tired of the term DevOps, or you don't like it for some reason, that's totally fine. Been asked before, okay, what does DevOps really mean? And one of my favorite definitions of this, the person on Twitter, Ian Coldwater, she does mostly security stuff, but somebody asked her once, what's your definition of DevOps? And she essentially said, it's about, figuring out how people and tools and processes can make software better. Like, how can you improve making software with the tools you have, which are your people, your ways of working together, and then technology. And that's really what that is, So you don't have to use the word DevOps. It's really just about how, and so in this case, it's really, how do we effectively, with the technology we have today, how do DBAs and developers effectively tune indexes in the best way possible? And I use the word silo in the title here because there are some real things that haven't changed much about how people work in the last 20 years when it comes to databases. We have a comment from JD, not use the term DevOps, but how will we look cool in terms of in front of others? Sarcasm, which, I mean, that's the thing, is the word DevOps, I don't mind the word, but it is actually getting kind of old. Like, the word used to be cool, but it's sort of losing its buzzword flair. So I'm almost like, I'm fine if the word goes away, but we do, even if we don't use the word anymore, we do still need to think about, like, how do we do this better and smooth things out? And how do we get across these barriers between developers and DBAs? So when I first started working with databases, we had, I joined this really small, it was like 100 people startup. And we had a database administration team. And we had a bunch of different development teams. And they were all just great people. Loved working there. Really exciting people doing exciting things. But the database team was really separate from the software developer team. And it was very siloed. Like, each team sort of forms this cohesive unit, knows each other well, trusts each other. And there's not nearly as much trust across those teams. So collaborating together, and everyone, like I'm saying, everyone is awesome. These are not like bad people. These are not unfriendly people. These are smart people who are like exciting to work with and do great stuff and are really smart, but still working across, like figuring out how to get everybody's knowledge to do something like index tuning was hard. And figuring out how do you do this most effectively so that you can actually not, because the DBA team, there's only so many DBAs per a lot of developers. So how do you actually make use of that, their time most effectively, take advantage of their strengths without it being like you need to review every line of code that goes anywhere, which is just never going to happen. It's just, so we're not, in the modern world, it's hard to really break down these silos. And there's interesting research around about, how many people does a single person really know and trust really well? Like, how many people can you mentally hold in your sort of group? It does vary by culture, but it's often not 100 people. right? You just don't have time to know that many people well. So knowing that we are going to be, just as humans, likely to still work in smallish groups, and we tend to establish trust within that group, and it's harder to trust outside of that group over time. How do we take advantage of technology and processes to make index tuning easier? And then also there's other things to think about. This is also something that I think hasn't changed in a long time. So this is a tweet. If you don't follow Taryn on Twitter, you should follow Taryn on Twitter. Taryn is currently the database administrator for Stack Overflow, which, as you can imagine, they have some fairly serious performance requirements, seeing as I'm sure we're all there right now looking up answers to how to do things. But, you know, she tweeted the other day, you know, they had deployed new queries, and she needed to test some indexes out in production. I used to find this as well, and I found this as well on different systems. At times, you have a situation where you just need to make it as fast as you can, as fast as possible. And certain changes, like just changing around the T-SQL, in some of these environments, it's not acceptable to just change a stored procedure live, for example, because there is a fairly high risk of incorrect, you know, oops, the logic is different, it doesn't return the same result. But with a change like changing indexes, or there's similar changes, like sometimes plan guides fall into this, there's certain changes where there's certainly bugs that could happen in SQL Server, but the likelihood of your index change, unless it's an indexed view change, there's always an exception, right? The likelihood of most index changes causing incorrect results to go down is lower. You could accidentally slow down some queries by changing indexes, right? But it's mostly going to change performance. So sometimes in some environments, the ability to do that is acceptable, in part because of speed, of wanting to fix things right away. And by the way, I have created an index in production that did make inserts, updates, and deletes fail. You can cause problems by creating indexes. Not saying you can't. But it wasn't incorrect results, it was just failed. But anyway, because of the need to respond quickly, and because of a kind of tolerance for the risk of the change, sometimes testing in production is acceptable when it comes to index tuning as well. And I think this is a question, I'm not saying everyone needs to do this. I am saying some people do this and it's fine. So for these folks who have kind of urgent situations, it makes sense to have kind of a change process that does allow teams, we need to either be able to make changes in production and then sync them back through our software development cycle at times, or do the other way really fast, right? But there are some situations where it is very hard to reproduce query behavior outside of production. And this is a factor that goes into this. So this is the siloed model. This is the one that I'm going to recommend moving away from. The siloed model there's kind of a line between the development environments and the developers' work and production, and it's kind of a one-way street. In this model, we've got our production database and we've got DBAs on one side. And then we have, on the other side, we have developers, we have a shared development database. And I somewhat optimistically here have that the database is in version control. So if you've got your chat window handy, I'm actually curious how many of you, like if you could just say, yes, we have our database in version control, or no, we don't have our databases in version control. I would just be curious to know how many of you actually do have your databases in version control in general. In surveys, we have some person who says, I wish. One person says, we're cool kids. Another person says, no. We have 3 yeses following that. We have one person who says, yes, but we do it after deployment. And it's better to start somewhere than nowhere. We have a couple more yeses, some more no's. We have a partially, so getting there. We have someone who's working on it now. So we have a mix here. In surveys that we've done, Redgate has done some surveys, and the last one we did, 55% of more than 2,000 respondents, only 55% said they have their databases in version control. So you guys are actually, I'm seeing, I think a little more than half here. This is very unscientific, but people who don't are saying they're looking into it. So I think in order to work on something like index tuning across silos, I think version control is really, really helpful. And I'm going to show you some tooling you can build on top of version control, even if you don't have your database in version control yet. And what I'm going to show today, by the way, I am not advocating, I have to show you some tooling because I want to show you something other than drawings, but you can accomplish this with different tooling. What I'm showing you today, you could accomplish with Microsoft SSDT. You could accomplish it with vendor tools. You could accomplish it with open source software, right? There's a variety of ways of doing this. Choose one that fits with your budget and your needs. So but it will provide a good foundation, because the thing about version control is it will give us a way that a point of collaboration and communication across these teams. So it is really helpful for this. But in this original shared model, and so someone says, we deploy the database through DACPack. Does that mean the database is in version control? And the answer is probably. So if you're deploying your database through a DACPack, my guess is that that DACPack is probably generated by comparing something that's in version control with your target database. So as long as the source of that comparison has been put into version control, it probably is. But you could generate a DACPack without ever actually pushing something up to a centralized repo. Like, I can't prove it, but the answer is probably in that case. But I think version control is a good foundation for this. In many situations, however, the developers may have code in version control, but nobody else has any access to the version control. So when I was working at that small startup, this was actually how we worked. And it just meant that every time I had a suggestion for an index change, I had to send a whole bunch of email and script things out and do a variety of things. That was a long time ago. With modern tooling, we have better ways to do this, where now we can actually have people from both sides suggesting changes into the version control in a safe way, such that if it's not a good suggestion, it's just communicated back and it doesn't hurt anything. So we want to move version control more to the middle and have both of these groups be able to do this in order to be able to tune across silos. That's one of the tools that we're gonna use in terms of crossing those silos. The interesting thing, and I think this is also true about query tuning, is that it's hard for developers to just do index tuning, because often they often on this development side, notice that I've drawn this shared database as smaller than production. Developers are often using a development environment that is similar-ish to production, but it's either kind of old and outdated, or it's much, much smaller. It's not very recent. It's very hard to know what indexes is your query going to use, and what is the query plan going to be like without the actual production data. Because SQL Server will use a lot of things to determine a query plan, including what data is in the tables, how is it distributed, what parameters is a parameterized query called with, how much memory is on the SQL Server will impact query plan generation and impact choices of how to use information from indexes. Parallelism is the number of processors. So what a developer sees on this little shared environment will be quite different than production. And Hugo says sometimes it's also extremely skewed data. In cases where, and we're going to play a little obstacle bingo later, in cases where you're not allowed to use that production data in your development database and you just have to generate data, the data may be wildly different than what you have in production too. So the query literally might run fine on the dev machine, And when it gets to production, it might really, really not run fine. And it's also really hard for developers to know how, so we created this new feature. Are customers going to be crazy about this and loads of them are going to use it? Or are a few of them going to use it? Or are none of them going to use it? It's very hard for them to kind of know how heavily hit will this be? Do we need to cache this? I mean, there's a lot of tuning things that you kind of find out after something gets introduced into production. So tuning these things can be quite tricky. And when developers don't have access to production, that's not really a fun time. But DBAs have kind of the opposite problems. Like this is the problem, since we're not all working as one team, DBAs, on the other hand, once a problem starts in production, what they see is, oh, okay, we've got a lot of blocking because this query is taking a really long time. Why are we running this query now? And usually, depending on how the code has been written, usually when there's no comments or the ability to see inside the code on the SQL Server, why is this query being run? Now, if you do use stored procedures and you have comments in the code, you might be able to see that. But a lot of modern applications are written with the business logic perhaps being in the application tier, and parameterized queries are being run against the SQL Server, and it can be very, very hard to track that down. Or perhaps nobody put comments in the code. That happens sometimes too. Also, for DBAs, it's tricky because often, as I said, they can't check changes into source control. They don't have the ability to use the version control system if it's been set up. And then when changing an index, it's, the SQL Server engine, it'll give you these missing index hints. You can get these green hints in execution plans. They're the same hints that are shown in the index tuning dynamic management view. So like sys.dmexec, index usage stats, and friends. SQL Server will request indexes, but it is, I generally say it's kind of like a 2-year, you have a small child at the grocery store and they sort of want everything they can see. And it may not be good for it. It just sort of is asking for anything that might kind of make it happy. It's not, you don't want to give it everything it asks for necessarily. And so the DBA is kind of left with like, well, I don't know what to do about this. We have a question, which version control tool do you recommend? The answer for that is absolutely Git for version control. And the reason I say Git is because, and this is going to sound really lame, everyone else is using it. So if you are in a workplace where not everyone else is using Git, like if you are in a workplace where people are using Perforce, for example, or Mercurial, and everyone is crazy about Perforce or Mercurial, I would say go with the flow, use what they are using. However, if you're in a workplace where people use different things or nothing is really predominant, Git is definitely the leading solution. Most developers use it. Many, many developers like it. There's tons of documentation on it online. There's huge amounts of tooling. Going forward, it has the greatest compatibility. There's a question, is it okay to use TFS? I actually wouldn't use, so TFS, also known as Team Foundation Server. So this is part of the Azure DevOps Suite family right now. So I'm not saying don't use Azure DevOps, but when you create a new Azure DevOps project, either server or services, the thing, TFS, BSTS, whatever you want to call it, when you choose your repo type, Microsoft actually recommends that you choose Git for the repo in the Azure DevOps project. They provide the TFS repos as more of a legacy thing. So even Microsoft actually suggests that you use Git repos for the greatest kind of compatibility and experience. Folks who are using TFS are kind of gradually migrating to Git over time. So again, if this is going to be a huge political battle, I would just go with whatever people are using at your organization. But if you're looking for a new solution, Git has won the version control wars generally. So if you're looking to learn, it's best to generally learn on the one that everyone's using. Also, there's loads of free ways you can use Git, which is cool. So devs and DBAs have problems. And this is the model I'm going to recommend in terms of bridging the silos, in terms of using the tooling and processes out there that are kind of broadly available now. And I will say some of the things I'm looking at. So Query Store is on the screen here. Query Store is only available in SQL Server 2016 and higher, right? So if you're not on SQL Server 2016 yet, this isn't something you can just implement. However, in terms of new development projects, when people are considering things, this is a good thing to advocate for and say, hey, if we can use a newer version of this product, either Azure SQL Database or a more recent version of SQL Server, this has better ways for us to collaborate on performance tuning, and pointing this out can be really helpful. So one of the things I recommend a lot is dedicated development databases. So before we had a shared development database there, I think dedicated development databases are really helpful for index tuning, even if you don't have production-like data in them. So if you have to have, so if production is 80 terabytes of data, hopefully your production is not 80 terabytes of data. It may not make sense for every developer to have an 80 terabyte development environment. It probably doesn't make sense for them to have a shared 80 terabyte development environment either. Maybe you have a staging environment somewhere that's not pictured here that's similar to production. But when people are first starting to develop changes, you want some place where they can experiment quickly. And if I am sharing a development database with Hugo, if we are using a shared development database, and I start messing around with different indexes to try to fix something in production, anything Hugo's doing is impacted by me messing around with those indexes, and he'll be slowed down. Or he won't notice what I'm doing, and he'll be like, why is it doing, what is Kendra doing, right? If Hugo and I have separate development databases that we can work in, we can use branches in version control. I can create a branch, a feature branch in version control, which is like a private workspace where with my little database, I can work on changes, and using whatever tooling I'm using, I can commit my changes into version control and mess around, do whatever I want with my database. Nobody else is impacted. And then anytime I want, hey, Hugo, could you look at my work? Hugo can switch to my branch, apply it to his development database, and see what I'm doing, even if we're in different countries, right? So having separate development environments, which, yes, we want them to be as production-like as we can in reasonable situations, and we can kind of dig into how that would work later. That frees us up to be able to work better with version control because we have a database to go with our own branch and not step all over each other. So query tuning and index tuning, at least we can experiment faster, even if we can't always have the same data as production, right? Because that's never going to be perfect in terms of having the same data as production. Even if I have a very recent copy of the production data set, does it have the exact thing that's having a problem in production right now? Now, the version control has moved into the middle of the picture here, because in order to do index tuning across silos, we really want these DBAs to be able to say, hey, I'm seeing an issue in production. I think an index like this would fix this problem. And to create a branch, pop the index change in there, create a pull request, and have it reviewed really, really quickly by the dev teams. And this isn't like, DBAs are totally up to this. This is not something, you do not have to learn Java to do this. You do not have to, you need to learn a few tools depending on the tooling you're using. Like if you're using tooling that only exists in Visual Studio, you might have to learn to use Visual Studio a little. I've done it. It's not as bad as you think. Like the first 3 days are kind of bad, and then you're like, okay, I'm used to it. Or VS Code, depending on the tooling, right? So you might have to learn a little extra tooling, but it's worth it in order to be able to suggest that change. Similarly, if we are in one of those environments where we have to make a change directly to production, like an index tweak, we then want a way where anyone who's involved in that, because it's going to be the DBAs who are definitely involved, where those people can say, oh, we made this change. We need to get this into the version control in the middle so that all of the people who are working out of the version control can see, oh, a change was made, and it makes their way into their dev environments. Because I absolutely have been in the situation where we made the change in production, we forgot to send the email, or the email, somebody forgot to do something after they got the email. It never made its way into version control. And then a later release either undid the change or caused a problem in the environment too, right? So we want everybody to be able to push things into version control so that our production environment stays in sync with our dev environments. Query store, I'll talk about here, is a fantastic mechanism for if you have the ability to use it. And it is, the good news is, although it's SQL Server 2016 and higher, it is available in all editions. So it's in standard edition. I think it's even in Express edition? Question mark? Hugo, is it an Express edition? I think it's, you don't have to pay extra for Query Store, and you can use it to pass information from production. So we're almost to the demo, but these are the three, I think, changes. And you may not be able to make all these changes at once, right? We can't always make every change all at once, but I think in terms of working across these silos, oh, thank you, Hugo. I was actually kidding, but Hugo says, correct, it's in all editions. It is the best to have, whenever I kind of pick on Hugo whenever he's in a session I'm in, because I'm like, dude, I know that you know so much. I'm just going to ask you questions whenever I don't know. So it's kind of unfair. I can plug your blog. Is it SQLServerFast.com? Hugo has fantastic blogs on execution plans if you want to check them out. But these three bits of technology or processes, I think, can really help cross these silos. So let's take a look at some demo here. Because what would an index tuning session be without a little index tuning demo? I do, by the way, if you want to see the demos for today, I have them all up in a repo here. And I believe I have it set to public. So I will just pop this into the chat. Let me send this to all attendees. This is the repo I have here. Yes, it's public. If you haven't used Azure DevOps Services before, it has a really extensive free tier, and it will let you experiment and play around with repos for free. So I really, really like using this. GitHub is also free, and they have GitHub Actions. There's all sorts of things you can do for free, but I think Azure DevOps Services is really fun to play around with. So the script I'm working with is actually in this repo that I'm running through today. So let's say we hear that, we come into work in the morning and we hear, things have gotten really slow in production. Is it related to that thing we deployed yesterday? Right. And maybe this question comes after we deploy things. One of the benefits of everyone having access to automation tooling, like you have in this, you could also be using Octopus Deploy or Jenkins or TFS, is you can do things like you can give people the ability to just view this. They don't have to be able to edit it as well, but you can give them view access. But it's really easy to go in and look at. So I'm in releases now, an index demo, and I have a deployment to my fake production environment, which happens to be on the same SQL instance as my dev environment. Please don't do that. There's a t-shirt, everyone has a dev environment. Some people are just lucky enough that it's different than their production environment. That's my demo environment. But we can see, okay, when was the latest release that went out? What did it do? And we can also see here on the screen, I did get my Zoom it working for a reason, exactly what was deployed. In this case, I had it deployed from a branch. And I can actually, there's a way I can click through here, but I can also just go to the repo. And if I click on the branches tab here, I can see all of the branches that I've got here. And I can see, okay, here is the one that was deployed last. I can even do things like, if I want to compare it, I can say compare this branch, and I can compare it to the deployment before it, what was actually added in this deployment. And we we merged a pull request, adding an indexed view, and yeah, we added the indexed view. So what is the change that was made yesterday? And this was actually when I was a DBA at first, this was a huge pain point, just figuring out what was actually in the last release. We'd have to go into a file share and pull things open and look things out. I think it's actually, if you can get it so everyone can actually see this, it's much easier to be able to review this. And some folks earlier said that they use a change management system and they can link in changes from their repo this way. That's a great way to be able to do it. In this case, we can see, okay, we created an indexed view, right? Here's the definition of the view. It has a unique clustered index on it. And this was to help make some read queries faster. But what we're hearing is that some inserts now are weirdly slow. If we do have a tool like Query Store, and we have a way, this is assuming, this is for those environments. Query Store is only going to be useful to you for environments where you are allowed to have some production data, which may be, masked in some ways, that sensitive data may be removed from some parts of it. But if you're allowed to use that as a basis for your dev environments, then Query Store can be helpful for this. If Query Store can't be, if your data can't be used that way, then really to triage a lot of instances like this, you either have to guess what might be the problem, or you need to have a way where people who can see the Query Store in production can sit with, maybe on a Zoom meeting, but where information can be shared between the teams so that you can either see the Query Store in production with read-only permission, or that data can be passed back in some way, because Query Store is restored with an individual database. You have to turn it on for the database. But if you've turned it on for the database, you can do quick things like just say, if I have a process where my dev database is restored from production overnight, maybe sensitive data is masked in it, then I can do things like say, oh, well, what's been slow in, we do have to change our time scale here. I just want to say within the last day. Right, but we can see if I actually, and I think it's gone just over the 24-hour mark. So I actually think, let's go 2 days. There we go. I set up this demo just over 24 hours ago. But we could see things like, oh, okay, there's an insert into, this table that's slow. Can I find the execution plan for that? And we can look at the execution plan. Even if it's not the top one on the list, we can still do things like query, the Query Store, views, functions, dynamic management, whatever's. And we can say, okay, we want to find a query that's like this, right? So in this case, I'm looking for all the inserts. I could make it more specific if I just wanted to, oh, you're saying something regarding this thing is slow. I can search around for it in different ways and figure out what is, how many times has it been run? On average, how long is it taking? So we can see that on average, this is taking, just in CPU time, 51 seconds to do this insert. And we can also, if I take out the sample text here, right? If we look at this, I'm just formatting it. Right, this is not like selecting a lot of data. This is inserting static data here. That shouldn't take a long time. If you do get the query ID here, you can still, if you want to use the graphic thing, you can open up tracked queries and enter in the query ID. And look, it did this. It does this to me. It doesn't paste well. Everyone has bugs. We need to delete that and actually type 130. It's a little weird. Oh, and I need to configure it to look for things within the last 2 days. And we can see the plan here. Now, why would a query that takes, that is doing just inserting values, it isn't even doing a select, why would it take this long? Well, we can see a variety of things in here. If we kind of hunt around this, this is the clustered index on the indexed view we created. So part of this is the clustered index update. Like our indexed view We are only inserting into a tiny little table that's a list of first names, but it is somehow having to update our indexed view. And if we scroll to the right, oh, well, okay, it's doing enough work here that it has larger lines. It's just an estimated plan, but it has larger lines and it's got these parallel operators. It's doing a clustered index scan of this different table, first name by birth date. So the execution plan, like this is part of why collaborating across the groups is really helpful. This execution plan is from production. Query Store helps make it easier to find these plans and share them between people, because I may not be able to generate this execution plan against development. Or if I can get that data regularly updated in development, I can have direct access to it too. So either by collaboration or by being able to refresh the environment regularly, that can provide me with information that can just save a ton of guesswork. Because if I did have a tiny little data set in dev, how would I ever guess, that, so how many rows, let me just hover over one that's easier to zoom in on, right? Like here's the number of rows that it thinks is 152 million rows that it thinks it's gonna have to scan out of that table. And it's doing a hash match aggregate, it's doing all of this stuff against it. One thing that hopefully I can do, I don't always have the ability to do this, but maybe if I am able to have a similar environment, I can actually test out that insert. So I'll just do Control L here, just estimated plan. Obviously with production environments, we don't just want to go randomly testing inserts. So I just did an estimated plan here, and we can see that we are getting this similar execution plan that is just to insert a row into the ref.firstname table. It's having to go scan all of the tables in first name by birth date. So this is actually a common thing that can happen when people create indexed views. A common story I hear about indexed views is we created an indexed view and we thought everything was going to be great, but as soon as we deployed it to production, everything was really bad and slow and we had to pull it out of there. The most common cause of that is this is the, let me find the definition for the indexed view here. Here's the indexed view. What's happening in this indexed view is it's joining two tables. It's joining ref.firstname, which is a small table, with a big table, which is first name by birth date. And it's saying for every, based on the first name ID, we want to figure out, how many babies of a given first name were named per birth year. In order to keep this index view constantly updated, if I add or change, if I delete a row, if I do something to a row in ref.firstname, it needs to figure out, does that impact the results of the index view? It has to actually update the indexed view. So what's happening when I'm inserting rows into ref.firstname is it's doing this big check of, do I need to update the indexed view? And what we can see in this query plan is that in order to carry it out, it is scanning the entire large table. Now, if we dig into the query execution plan, and I would like to note that there's no green index hint up here. This doesn't generate an index request in this particular incarnation. This will not be in the index dynamic management views. Sometimes variations of this will, but this particular one just doesn't. But what we can look at is say, okay, it's looking up based on the first name ID, it's trying to figure out partial ag and expression 1009. Well, what columns does it need? We can actually go over here. What columns is it pulling out of this table? We can see that we know it's joining on first name ID. So that's an interesting possible key column. It's also outputting that fake birth date stamp. This is faked out data in the data set, so it's actually a fake birth date stamp. So that potentially might be an included column we want in the index, right? The joins in the query are just based on the first name ID, but it's also, it's using that column in order to figure out the year in which the baby was born. So we could work through this and we could figure out that one fix to this to make the inserts faster is we could create an index, right? So in my dev environment, And since they are on the same SQL Server instance, this is the dev environment. The production environment actually has prod in the name. I know that's super lame. It's just a demo environment. Right, so we could create that index. Creating indexes isn't always cheap though. Like this still is running. In the real world, this is one of the things that makes index tuning extra fun. Creating an index in production, it could, and I noticed that I'm doing this offline. I might want to say with online equals on, right? This could block a lot if I just ran this in the production environment, and it takes, right now we're up to like 30 seconds. It could take a minute. It could take a bunch of time. So creating indexes, although it's a lower risk for making data incorrect, it can, if you don't have Enterprise Edition and you can't do online creates, it can create a lot of blocking. But it also just, you know, like it can use a lot of resources while it's getting created too. So this is the other reason why, if, okay, finally created here. If you do have an 80 terabyte production environment, do you really want 80 terabytes in every developer environment, right? But now if let's look at that execution plan again. And this one I'll actually, I have the rollback in there. So let's just I'll do actual plan and I'll actually run it. It'll actually roll back the change. But looking at the execution plan here, the plan has changed, that it's now doing an index seek to look for the matching rows. If I put a row in ref.first name, it's like, oh, is there a matching row in the other table? Do I need to update the index U? Now it can go straight to the row it needs, right? So this also happens really, really quickly. So here's the magic of the pull request. Let's just do a quick commit for this. Now I'm using a Redgate. I work for Redgate, so I'm using a Redgate tool because it's what I know, right? I've already put myself in a feature branch called GroupBy Demo. So if you're using other tooling, if you're using SSDT, if you're using Flyway, if you're using Liquibase, if you're using something else, it'll look different, but it's generally, our goal is to get this into source control, right? So I'm going to say creating index to speed up insert. Right, so I can see what my change is here. I can commit it. I can push it upstream. And by putting this into a feature branch, and I'm using Git, so I push this up to my Git repo, which is in Azure DevOps. And now in Azure DevOps, if I go to my repo here, oh, I want to go back to the master branch. I'm like, why do things look different than I thought they would? It's because I wasn't in master. If I go back to that master branch, who am I logged in as here? I am logged in as me. Did I actually push? I did push. I'm in feature / group by demo. I don't have a feature branch here. So I'm in index demo. I'm on the right database. You know, I do believe in doing it live. So I did change one script that I didn't check in. What have I done? Or get log. Or was it Memorex? So, okay, I did creating index to, did commit, and I did push. And now it's refreshing very slowly. All right, here's state. I wonder, I'm like, so these are my deploys here. You know, am I looking in the wrong repo somehow is actually my question here. So what is the git command? Let's look up git commands live. I can show you a pull request example without this. We can just pretend that my suspicion is that I actually am pushing to a different repo than the one I have open here. I think this is, so I have a habit of doing multiple repos and multiple projects. I'm not alone. And sometimes I actually get confused. For the sake of time, we're at 4:16. For the sake of time, I'm going to show you, like this one I did yesterday. So literally this is just proof. I tested this yesterday, but somehow in my brain, I've become confused between then and now. Either that or yeah, what did I do with my push? In any case, the benefit of doing a pull request, how have I messed up my pull request? This is going to drive me insane, but so you can have the files in here. So like yesterday, here is the, example index we created yesterday. And then what you can do is you can add on reviewers, and this can be automated. So if there's specific tables that you want to get input on, if we ever change these tables, you can automate things like that. But you can also say, hey, I just want to get feedback from people. So if you're a developer and you're like, hey, does this look good? Or would you recommend anything? This is an obvious point of communication here. And people can comment back and forth. People can pull the code down to their machine. People can do all sorts of things in it. You can also build automation on here to build the code and do a variety of things in there. And I am just like, I pushed my branch, but I don't see my branch, which is just not normal. Wow. I'm going to figure this out. I'm going to put it in chat after the session as to exactly how did this happen? Because I'm like, oh, I can just check. Okay, that's my repository is right here. Get index demo state. Anyway, I have a couple more slides. It is the thing where though, it drives you nuts when it doesn't work the way it did yesterday. Right, here is this. And actually, it's the, there is a way that you can actually tell. There's a credential manager. So I'm using Azure DevOps, and I'm just like, I just can't leave it alone. I have to go for it. So you've got these account tokens in here, and I'm like, can I actually see how it's configured to talk to the repo in these? It's not that friendly in terms of what it's showing me. This is the project that I'm in though, right? Anyway, I'll figure it out after and I'll go over it. Just I've never had my pull request get confused in that way before. So, oh well. Yeah, my branch should show up in here. This is the releases folder. Oh, maybe I need to go over to all. So y'all, I just figured it out. I am logged in under 2 different accounts. Remember how I checked my account name here? I am probably using the I am a DBA account on the other one. So I was looking only at my branches. It is an under all branches. So if you do ever need to reset your credentials though, open the credential manager. So once I actually, this is my feature branch that I have just checked in. We can see my commits on that. That was going to drive me insane. This is not the first time I have forgotten that. Just use one account. Don't be like me. So now if I want to do a pull request, at least I'm not going to itch anymore about like what happened with that. Was I using the wrong repo? You can do a new pull request from anyone's branch. So you can say features GroupBy demo into master. It's being a little slow in populating the screen, but it's actually going to populate the screen in theory. There we go. And you can create it. You can add the reviewers. You can add tags there too. So the secret to this indexing thing though, one of the reasons you might want to get review on this is actually we don't need this index. So one of the things that if I did get review from this and I added another DBA, one thing they might point out is, hey, maybe we could add a foreign key instead of the index. If I create a foreign key, and I just accidentally tried to run the whole script. If I create a foreign key that lets SQL Server know about the relationship between these tables, it does take a little bit of time for it to create. So it is still going to be a deployment concern. But look at the execution plan for the insert now. If I'm just doing an insert into the small table, and there is a foreign key that says, oh, by the way, any rows in the large table have to have a corresponding row in the small table, it doesn't have to do any of that select stuff at all. Now, I might want the index for other things. I might want to test updates of names. I might want to test deletes, right? If that ID that joins them is ever going to change, I might want to be careful. But just for testing inserts, there might be another way. And that's, I mean, this is the whole thing with why crossing those silos is worthwhile, is that people on either side are going to have really different experiences. And the truth about what I may want to do with this pull request is I may want to say, oh, actually, I want to abandon this pull request, or I want to pull it back. I want to do other things and I want to change it. Right? That's the whole point of doing this all, is because every pull request shouldn't just be approved. So thank you for bearing with me in my case of multiple identities. It probably won't be the last time I make that mistake of accidentally using multiple identities and checking something in under the wrong account. And then being like, why doesn't it show up in my changes? So you see, version control makes everything easier. It does, I think, in the long run, version control does make a lot of things easier, because the truth is there are far more ways for me to confuse myself without using, at least there's a breadcrumb trail in version control. So tools that help with index tuning and help you work together as a team, even if you're really more than one team. Version control, I think, is really key to this. Query store can absolutely help when you can use it. Dedicated development databases can very much help as well. But the thing is, these all just increase, they give us more options for communication outside of email. So obstacle bingo. And we do still have a couple minutes left. Matt says all DBAs have multiple personalities. It's okay. It really, there's the no me. Then there's the no me. And then there's the oh no me. This DBAs love no, right? There's different obstacles, I think, to making things better. If you do have sensitive production data, so you can actually get a bingo. If you do have a bingo on here, then you win extra karma points today if you have 3 matching in any way. If you have all of them, then I feel really bad for you. Sensitive production data can be really tough. In some industries, you are just not allowed to use any production resources at all in dev. In that case, ideally, you can at least have collaboration between people and have, something like a shared screen or a people looking at each other's computers to troubleshoot something at times. Pull requests can still help in terms of communicating what changes are being proposed and getting feedback on them, and also using automation to get that feedback in a targeted way. Because like I said, you're not going to have, if you have a dedicated DBA team and a lot of developers, you're not going to be able to get a review of every change. So it's key to kind of figure out, okay, what are the types of changes that are most critical to get review on where you can help. I do think in the case of very large production databases, you are better off to have people with small development databases that aren't very production-like, but they each have their own, than to try to have a realistic single shared dev environment. There should be other environments as well. So we may want to have a production-like environment later in the pipeline, right? Because in the real world, we're going to have a QA environment and maybe a staging environment. So in the case of these really large databases, it makes sense for the staging environment to be very production-like. It may even make sense for QA to be pretty production-like at times, depending on what you're doing. But the development databases, it's not going to work to try to have an 80 terabyte there. Now, how big is reasonable? I mean, these days, it's not that hard to have a 2 terabyte database in a dev environment necessarily, depending on how fancy a SAN you have or what your tooling budget is. So it may be doable to have a couple terabytes, absolutely. But, you know, like there is a line. And it may, if you don't have that budget and that tooling, you may just want smaller ones as well. It's all about choosing the lesser evil here. And I do think there are big benefits to having those, the ability to experiment and to not be having me change something that impacts another developer and maybe causes a bunch of mistakes. If you don't have experience index tuning, it can be interesting starting index tuning in that environment. Just start simple. So I think one of the big issues is that there's so many things you could learn. You could learn column store indexes. They're really cool. You could learn Hekaton, like in-memory OLTP. You could just, but my advice is if you're just starting out, start with basic clustered and non-clustered indexes on row store. Those are going to be eminently useful for a really long time. There are going to be occasions where you want to use more specialized indexes like column store or XML or in-memory OLTP, but start with just, you know, kind of these basic ones that you're going to use a lot, and just start simple and build up from there. If you already have too many indexes, I wouldn't, sometimes people are really worried because they're like, we have 10 million indexes. How do I start? And my main advice there is just don't try to fix it all at once. You know, just work kind of gradually and trim where you can. But if you start to try to just trim as much as you can, you're probably going to hurt things and then screw up your whole project too. So there's a lot of obstacles to overcome, but it is really doable. And it is something that you can get ahead of. So just figure out, okay, what is the thing I could change that is likely to help the most in the short term, right? How can I kind of move the needle? And think about, you know, if you are doing something like saying, hey, I'd like to get the database into version control, explain, like, I think using something like pull requests could be really helpful in terms of you know, helping do targeted communication between teams and just helping us track what changes. One of the folks here actually commented that our database is in version control, but it only goes there after deployments. And I'm actually not totally against that. That's not like I wouldn't say that's the ideal way to do things, but sometimes, I mean, that's absolutely better than not having your database in version control, right? So if the way that you can start is just, hey, can we first automate a process to get it into afterwards? That is an iterative step that you can do. And then later on, you can say, okay, well, what if we kind of change what if for this database, we do a proof of concept of changing the workflow up and using automation to get it in version control first and then simulate a deployment before it goes to production, right? So just work iteratively and be consistently improving. And one of the things that it took me a really long time to learn was when you're proposing a change, you don't have to propose the change for forever. So you can sometimes say, oh, we should just do it this way. But you could also just say, hey, can we just let's try out working this way on this project for this period of time. And here are our goals, and we're going to see how successful we are. And then we'll see if we do this forever, right? You can use proof of concepts to experiment. And that can be safer to people. Instead of saying we have to do this for everything, it's all or nothing, proof of concepts can help you get started there. So if you want to learn more about everything we saw today, I have a session on using Git for database code that talks more about branching and pull requests that you can see online. There's a 6-minute video by my colleague, Grant Fritchie, who I believe is speaking tomorrow at GroupBy. I think he's talking about extended events tomorrow. He has an introduction to query store, and then we have a whole stairway on index tuning at SQL Server Central. So I think it's the end of my time.
Very good timing. But we have some time for questions as well.
Oh, cool.
There's a few questions that have come in to the chat and to the questions and answers. So we can just
Yeah.
time to go through
Oh, I
those.
see.
Yeah.
Thanks. So are there any open source solutions that a small environment could use for getting database schemas into source control? Read small environment, no budget. So there are some open source solutions for that. So I am going to give one that is a Redgate one first, just because I like it. I liked it before it was a Redgate thing. There is an open source solution called Flyway. It now says Flyway by Redgate because Redgate acquired it, but it does have multiple tiers. It is open source. It does have a free community tier that you can use. So if you look at the downloads and pricing, you can see everything that's available in the community edition. This is a migration style way to get your database into source control. So if you have no budget or you need free tools, you could use this. You could also use, depending on your setup, you might be able to use SSDT, which is free-ish depending from Microsoft. There are some rules around whether, like you may need Visual Studio. Sometimes you can get Visual Studio for free. So it might be free for you, or if you already have Visual Studio licenses, it might be free for you too. So SSDT is a state-based solution. So what SSDT will do is it'll check in full definitions for your objects for you. So like for a table, it'll check in, if we just script out this table. There we go. What you'll see in source control with something like SSDT is this full definition of the table and all its constraints and everything like this. With something like a Flyway, Flyway is a migration-based tool. If you want to, when you first create that table, you'll have the create table statement. But then like if you alter table, add column, you'll actually check in an alter table, add column statement. So you kind of have different options for different styles of tooling in terms of which you'd like to choose. There's also, I mean, there's even more. So there's a tool called DBUp, which is, I believe, for primarily .NET style applications. It is free and open source. It is similar to Flyway in that it is a migration style tooling. I don't know much about DBUp because I found it to be kind of a pain in the butt to install, and I kind of gave up. But there are people who use it. Flyway is pretty fast to install. So, but there are other tools out there as well. Even and for non-SQL Server tools, some of these like Flyway, actually, you can deploy to like all sorts of databases with it. You can deploy to Postgres. You can deploy to, yeah, here's the list of, it's a lot of different supported databases. My favorite being CockroachDB. So some tools out there will support many different databases. Some of them will just support one database. That's also something to kind of look at as you evaluate them. Matt asked, what are your thoughts on using a tool like Idera and Query Store? Could it introduce any unwanted overhead? So I might need some clarification on what does Idera, so I actually, since I work for a vendor, I try not to pay too much attention to, I try to have friendly relationships with other vendors, but not pay too much attention to all their products because you don't want to like accidentally copy something, right? Although I'm not on the product team, I do work a lot with our product team. So do you mean that Idera has a tool for Query Store, or do you mean just their monitoring tool, which has something similar to Query Store is my question. So I will answer this with the belief that it means a monitoring tool that has similar functionality to Query Store. Okay, monitoring query capture. So he clarified it in the chat, got it. There's always some overhead for a monitoring tool. So I would say Query Store is a little different than a monitoring tool in that it really Query Store is really focused on query tuning. Monitoring tools like your SQL Sentry, like your Idera, Redgate has one called SQL Monitor. Monitoring tools are a bit different because they do some of that query performance capturing, but then they have external resources that try to alert on availability. So Query Store doesn't have any alerting functionality, for example. They're always going to have some overhead. there are some people I know of, mostly through Erin Stellato does a lot of work with Query Store, and she said she has some clients who aren't able to turn it on because they have such high performance systems that it causes too much of a performance impact. I have talked to some folks who've had, you know, we're talking super high transaction systems, very high throughput systems. One of them was an application that was replaying a ton of banking transactions against a SQL Server, just massive load, and it turning on Query Store degraded the performance so much they didn't want to do it. So you have to, it's not on by default, and you do kind of want to be careful and test carefully. In recent versions of Query Store, they have started adding more configuration items that you can tell it a little bit more about how much data to collect, how to collect it, tell it to back off a little bit. But it is still something that I would be cautious with. And with any monitoring tool as well, I always say, you know, you want to test it outside of production first, then in production on your less critical servers, and work your way up, because the more you want to collect, the more impact you're going to have generally. It's just one of those things. The SQL Server monitoring space is a pretty mature space. So companies we've been building these monitoring tools for years. So the good news is most of these companies have already figured out what they shouldn't do, because it puts too much load on the server, because they have been doing this for years. So, but I still would say proceed with caution, because some workloads are truly special. How do you prepare initial setup, and how do you source control initial data? Is a question. So the initial setup part of this, I'm not sure what that means. Source controlling initial data, I think I get though. So with the initial setup, you'll need to tell me a little more about what you want there. Oh, and there's a question above this I am going to get to as well. I'm sort of reading upwards. There is a way, so certain data you might want to put as static data tables. So the notion of static data, SSDT has this notion, all the Redgate tooling has this notion about static data. You can actually check some data into source control. So for things like a list of countries with their country codes, right? You probably want that to be in every copy of the database. You probably don't want users editing it. You probably want to deploy it. Yeah, default data, I guess is what you're talking about. So for a lot of this default data, you would use static data for it. And let me see, I may even have a copy of some, but essentially what it does is the tool will just generate insert statements for your static data and store it into source control. I don't think I have any in this one. But for things like country codes, you might like that. The other types of data, the question is, do you want to deploy it just once, or do you want to deploy it every time? You know, how often do you want the scripts to run? If it's only to be deployed once, how you implement that is going to kind of vary by the tooling. So for instance, some of our Redgate tooling has a notion of something called a migration script, and a migration script will only just run once. So if you're, and with Flyway, for example, that would be similar to, sometimes with initial data, you would just put it in a migration script. It would always be run once, and then it would be done. With an SSDT, you would need to put it in, they have these as well, and I don't know that I have the folder here because I don't think I've created them, a pre or post deployment script you might put it in, or you might just run it as something before the script. So it's going to vary by the tooling you're using, but some things you would want as static data, and a lot of tools do that as well. Question, are there any DevOps tools for SQL to automatically transfer to production? Tell me a little bit more about that. Do you mean automatically deploy your code to production? Like there are, so one example, if I'm understanding this right, like Azure DevOps Services, this is Azure DevOps Services, the animal previously known as VSTS. And then there's Azure DevOps Server that used to be TFS. Like these pipelines are essentially ways that you can automatically transfer your SQL from different environments to production. Octopus Deploy is another one of those. You've got, kind of, these are just kind of automation and pipelines tools. GitHub Actions is where it's just a series of kind of triggers that you can do too. So I think that may be, if I didn't get that question right, just rephrase. And I can see that. Oh, there's a comment that Visual Studio Community Edition meets a lot of people's needs, and that one's free. Yeah, I think with Community Edition, there's some rules about the size of your company is all. Just read the licensing before you do it. I have to say, I'm a Microsoft MVP, so I just say into the camera, just check the licensing. And actually, for Visual Studio, the licensing is actually fairly clear online. Like I'm not telling you to read an 80-page document. There is a relatively short document written for human beings about the rules of using the different editions. So yeah, I just know there's some little gotchas in there that I diligently have to say to check the